Welcome back to another camera video. This time I'm looking at something slightly different from the normal reviews that I do. I was looking for a camera which was very small in size, very close to a premium compact camera. I wanted to keep the price down as low as possible, around about 200. And after a bit of searching around, I found this camera, which is a Canon EOS M10. Very tiny footprint for a mirrorless camera, and it's also relatively well featured. In terms of what it offers, it's got 1080p video recording, 18 megapixel APS-C sensor. We'll do a quick tour of the body to have a look at some of the controls. You have a switch on the top plate and that has a rotary setting, so you can set it to the video, stills and an automatic mode. Around the shutter release we have a dial, and next to that is the video recording button. That can be customized to different functions if you want to. Very simple and clean layout on the back. We don't have a lot of space, so we've just got our 4-way controller, menu button and playback. One of the interesting features with this camera is we have a flip-up LCD. If you're so inclined, you can do the selfie type shots as well. That might be of interest to you. Although the construction is plastic, it does feel pretty solid in the hand. It's quite nicely made. And it's reasonably comfortable. We do have a decent textured thumb grip on the back. There's a button for your Wi-Fi and NFC and a screw thread hole for an add-on grip. On the side, the switch for the flash, that's a spring-loaded mechanism. It's not the most powerful flash in the world, only a guide number of 5, but I am glad they included it because many cameras nowadays, they just don't have a flash at all, and there are times where they can be quite useful. Very simple connections on this, mini USB and HDMI with a card slot on the side. I'm glad they didn't put the card slot in the battery compartment because it is a bit of a pain to get them out. And we'll open that compartment now just to show you the battery that's included. The LP-E12 runs on quite a few Canon models. It's not the highest capacity, but I found the real world shooting, if you're not using much flash, you get around about 400 or 450 shots. But I would recommend that you do pick a spare one up. I'm not going to be too technical with this video, but I am going to cover a few areas to give you a better idea of what you can expect. And here's a quick comparison next to the GR3 in terms of the size. It's not much different, but of course, once you do put the kit lens on there, it is going to be thicker. Although, of course, there are other lens options. It's a fairly quiet shutter. I've never found it to be distracting. Buffer is fairly modest for RAW, but it's not bad for JPEGs. Of course, being mirrorless, you have the advantage that you can use adapters for different types of lenses, not just the Canon EOS ones, but other makers. If there is a weakness of the M10, it's relatively sluggish in terms of the low light focus. Canon have a fairly decent touchscreen on this camera. It's quite responsive. You can bring up the quick menu either via the icon on screen or with the D-pad center button. You will find yourself diving into the menus more with this camera purely because we just don't have that many controls on the body. That is one of the compromises you're going to have with a very small camera. You have your usual exposure modes and quite a lot of different scene modes, which I won't really go into those because they're your fairly typical ones such as macro and sports. Outside though, I found the focus speeds to be quite reasonable. It's not a super fast camera by any means, but it's certainly okay in terms of the focus speed in daylight. As well as the menus and other functions, you can flip through the images just by swiping. If you want to zoom in, you can use a double press just to get an idea of your focusing. Or you can use 2 fingers to pinch in, just as you would do on a phone. It's mostly quite intuitive operation on this camera, but like I said earlier, you will be diving around the menus a bit more than you would do with a larger camera. And I'll just show you some of the menus on the screen now. They're typical Canon, which means they're quite well laid out. Pretty standard stuff. You can navigate with a directional pad. You can also use the dial on the front. And of course, just use the touchscreen if you want to use that. With a camera like this, it's really important to have a responsive touchscreen. Because Canon have been fairly good on this for quite a while. Some of the Sony cameras, they didn't really get any touchscreen functionality until much later. I don't know if that's something that bothers you. I wanted to take a quick look at the image quality now, so I'm going to start off with the high ISO. It's really pretty good, even at around about 800 and 1600. I'd be happy enough using this camera up to around about 6400. Although there's a fair bit of colour noise, that will clean up quite effectively. And with the JPEGs, I turned the noise reduction down to low and I thought I got pretty good results off of that. If you go at the higher settings above that, I really don't think they're that useful. There's quite a lot of noise in there. There's a couple of interesting features that are on this camera. We have an auto lighting optimizer and there's a highlight tone priority. You find with everything turned off, you sometimes do clip the highlights, and the highlight tone priority does make quite a big difference when you've turned that on. You have multiple settings for the auto lighting optimizer, and this does affect the shadows and the highlights, although it doesn't affect the highlights quite as much as the highlight tone priority. I recommend leaving ALO on standard. This does seem to affect the tonal curve too with the raw files. If you're in very challenging situations with a big difference in contrast, I would then set the camera to high. The trade-off to that is that you will get a bit more noise in the shadow areas. You can sometimes see a bit of cyan shift with the skies. That's why I recommend using the ALO or HTP settings. They can make quite a big difference, or you can shoot raw. There's fairly decent recovery on the highlights with this sensor. And that will also give you a couple of stops, if not a bit more, in the shadows. You have multiple metering options with the camera. Most people will probably use the evaluative metering mode. If you have a very dark subject, sometimes it's just a touch on the bright side. This isn't an action camera, but the tracking focus is not too bad really. It does work okay. If you're doing an occasional shot with a moving subject, I think it's going to be fine. I did a quick test just walking towards a sign at normal walking pace and that held the focus okay. Only times I've really had any missed focus shots is in low light, so if you can keep that focus assist light on or just try and focus on a higher contrast area. I'll put some sample images up on screen while I share some of my thoughts. With any camera at this price point, we're going to have some compromises. The most obvious one is the fact that we don't have a viewfinder, and that can be a problem for some people. I will say that the LCD display is pretty good overall in terms of clarity and contrast. You do manually have to adjust the brightness, and that can be a bit annoying in sunlight. The flip-up display can be quite useful, not just for selfies. You can do lower angle shots. Image quality is definitely more than good enough. For 18 megapixels, I think the resolution is absolutely fine for most people. As a general purpose travel camera, I think it's quite a good option, particularly at this price point. Cameras are getting quite expensive these days. It really comes down to if you want to spend that sort of money on a camera. If you want something even slimmer, do have a look around for that 22mm pancake lens. I know that the Ricoh does have a newer sensor and it has better dynamic range. But still, I think the price is too high, at least in my opinion. The 15 to 45 is a 24 to 70mm equivalent. Has a fair amount of vignetting and there's some distortion, but it's not a bad lens overall. You should be able to get the camera and the kit lens for around about that 200 price point. If you've got any of your own suggestions for cameras in this price range that you think are worth considering, do drop a comment down below. Don't forget to check out some of my other videos. I've done quite a few on photography items and other products. And as usual, thanks for watching.